So Jacques has asked me to do a little bit of talking tonight. I'm not very good at this, so excuse me. Good evening, everybody! Welcome to the Business Book Club, something that I look forward to every month. It's taken off like a tsunami. This started off, my name is Deborah. On behalf of Scoops Theatre of Books, we'd like to welcome you here, those that are new in the house tonight. We're so glad to have you here tonight. Fourways Chamber of Commerce, put up your hands. Woo! Thank you guys for being here tonight. Douglas Kruger, thank you for being here tonight. Nonto, we have an author that's launching the first vernacular Zulu poetry book on the 15th. You're all invited. Thank you for being here tonight, Nonto. Thank you very much. It's going to be an absolute awesome launch. First timers here tonight, I welcome you to Scoops Theatre of Books. The only bookshop that you should be in.
Exactly.
The only bookshop in Johannesburg that's worth visiting, don't you think?
Yes.
And all those familiar faces that we've seen. 120 authors in 14 months, South African and African authors we've done in this store. And we are advocating all South African authors because why are we not buying South African? Promoting literature. People say, do people really read? Actually, yes, they are starting to read. It's becoming very sexy. Because now the books that we should be reading are on the shelves, accessible and affordable. Books being a supposed luxury instead of a necessity has started the business. One of the projects that we do here, Business Book Club, was started off at a singles evening that we had, where Jacques said to me, Debs, I want to do something. I want to do something that's really cool. And I said, well, why not? What do you want to do? He says, no, well, I want to start a business book club. What must we do? I said, well, that's so bloody easy because we've got some of the best authors in the world. Those that you may not have heard of, but those that you have heard of. So what better platform can you give an author than a platform like this, where you have people like yourselves that come for the reason. There's a whole big reason behind Jacques' idea. And we sat and we brainstormed, and I said, one thing I want you to do, I want you to start building libraries. Every author that I work with, we try and build libraries because giving books away is better than throwing them away. Hence your books that are here, that are being catalogued, that are being photographed, are going to the signature library, and Jacques will tell you about this. And I was so excited about this, and I thought, what better way to get people away from their television sets and come and actually talk to each other and talk to the authors. Authors are accessible. Get into their heads. I said to Frans tonight, I am going to get into your gut, your head, your brain, alles in your butt. And he said, do it. And this is what's so great for Bibliomaniacs. Kim Hunter, thank you for being here tonight. Tango with Text, our blogger. And it just excites me that we meet all these fabulous people, and we can meet all these fabulous people without paying 10,000 Rand for a ticket to actually go and see them. No offense, Douglas Kruger. We talked about this, paying for people to see people. You don't have to in a platform like this because Jacques is paying it forward. The forward is building the signature library, filling it with books, with shelves, whatever you guys have got in your capacity to help us do this. When that is filled up, the next one, we will do the next one. And I think on ground level in literature, we are the people to do this. We cannot wait for institutions to do this. Everything is institutionalized. This is not an institutionalized thing. This is something that you've come out willingly to come and participate in, and I thank you very much. Give yourself a round of applause. Oh my God. I am so super excited to have you here tonight, Mr. Frans Cronje. It is an absolute honor for Scoops to have you to our book club tonight as our third guest. And I cannot wait to get into conversation with you, and I know A lot of other people can't wait to get into conversation with you. And I would like to hand over now to Jacques, who has started this off. And I promise you by the end of the year, I was thinking, Jacques, maybe all the authors now, at the end of the year, we can get them all back on the same plate, all 12 of them, and really have something stunning in December. What do you think?
Fabulous.
I think that sounds like a fabulous idea too. See where our growth is taken and take this forward even more. This is a platform for the authors, for business people, networking, building libraries, getting people to read. Let's do it. Jacques Velleman, everybody.
Thank you, Deborah. And while we're clapping, I just want to thank Deborah for hosting us here at Scoops. Without this beautiful venue, it wouldn't have been possible. So just thank you for Deborah for hosting us at Scoops. Deborah, is there a way to turn up the sound perhaps? Yes. I know that the people at the back, they've got a lot of background noise there, so I just want to make sure that everybody can hear us. Dave, can you guys hear us? Is this better? I've got to get my mouth closer to the mic. Thank you for that. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Business Book Club. This is a monthly event that we've started to organize, and the reason where this all came from is I'm a business coach. And I've realized that to change behavior, you've got to start with knowledge. It's the seed, because you don't know what you don't know. So knowledge gives you the opportunity to change your behavior. And when we have a change in behavior, we can change our circumstances and we can change our futures. We can change our businesses and we can change the life of South Africa. But when I started the Business Book Club idea, it was easy to say, well, we need to read books and we could possibly get authors. But there was a catch. It's about knowledge and sharing that. And we wanted to find out and figure out, but how could we, from the privileged people around this table, sitting here tonight, how can we get this stuff out there? And that's where we linked with the Signature Library. The Signature Library is a library in Soweto, and it's there for the community. And all the books that you've donated so nicely tonight, we thank you for that. Those books are all going to the library, to the children and to the community, to give them something to start something. And that something is knowledge. And that will give them an opportunity to change behaviors. I'm not saying it's the only thing that you need to change behaviors, but it definitely is a hell of a start when you have knowledge. So thank you for all your donations. Now, what I love about the Business Book Club is that you actually don't have to read a book to come here tonight. So it makes our access, or our entry access, quite accessible to all of you. But what we are doing differently is we are inviting the authors, and tonight we've got Frans Cronje. I was introduced to Frans a while ago when I read his first book, about 2 or 3 years ago, Time Traveler's Guide. And when I saw the title, I knew that this was something that I had to get hold of. Being passionate about South Africa, and have made a decision a long time ago that I want to stay here. And I want to make my bed in this country, and I want to know what the future possibly could look like. What could I prepare for? And I read his first book and I was absolutely fascinated by it. It really gave me tools to put a few strategies in place. But his second book, South Africa in 2030, is a much more in-depth study of what this country would look like in 15 years' time. So I want to thank Frans for the research that him and his team at the International Race Relations have done into the study and that they've given us access to. So I'm going to allow Frans to share with us the insights in the book. And then afterwards, I want you to think of one question that you can ask Frans about what you could do to implement in your businesses and do something differently that could make a difference and a change in this beautiful country where we live in. So without further ado, I'm handing over to Frans. Frans, thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you for coming to listen to what I have to say. We're going to talk tonight about a book. At the back, you must wave at me if you have trouble. You're fine. We're going to talk about a book, but we're actually talking about, are you struggling? Is that better? Okay. Wave at me again if it slips. We talk about a book, but we're actually talking about the future of our country. And we'll get into the book and who I work for and the arguments and so on in the course of the evening. And I'll sketch a bit of context for you in a while, but to set the scene for that, the book starts with the story of a hawker, a vegetable seller, a young man by the name of Muhammad Bouazizi, who some of you may recognize as someone who changed the world forever. In December of 2010, Muhammad set himself alight outside a municipal government office in a rural town in Tunisia, sparking what would later become the Arab Spring. It's a small rural town of no significance, and he's an otherwise unremarkable young man. But quite ominously, at his funeral, which is attended by an extraordinary number of people, considering where and who he was, the funeral party chants, "We weep for you today, but we will make those who killed you weep." And they do. Tunisia's president flees into exile. Within weeks and a year after his death, the Arab Spring stretches in a band 4,000 miles from Morocco's west coast right through the Middle East. 16 countries will experience changes of government or significant destabilization. The civil war in Syria draws its momentum straight out of those events. The terror attacks in London this week do the same thing. The purpose of scenarios, and the book is about scenarios, is to call that before it happens. Good scenarios give you knowledge of the future that is as good as your knowledge of the past or the present, which is the challenge we've set ourselves, and in some respects we might have pulled it off. And the importance of that is extraordinary, and our own country is such a fantastic example. If we met here in August of 1985, let's say the evening of the 16th of August, last night was the Rubicon speech. And Pierre Botha has just addressed the National Party, and he said to them, amongst other things, in the face of economic and political reality, he says, "I will not lead white South Africa down the path of abdication and suicide." And the context is catastrophic. We'll spend 4 of 10 years of the 80s in recession. The American banking group Chase Manhattan will call South Africa's loans, and the country's effectively bankrupt. White conscripts engaged in battles with Cubans and young black activists in townships around the country. And if someone stood here for you that next evening, the 16th of August 85, and said to you that I think, for all we see, within a decade, the last leader of the National Party will be gearing up to become the tourism minister in an ANC cabinet, you would have thought, no. And that's the purpose of this, and having softened you up sufficiently both on just how remarkable change can be when it happens, and what seemingly insignificant events can trigger it, we get into the story of the book itself. And the context for us to have a discussion is some of what I set out for you today. Today, South Africa is technically in recession, and we have very serious problems, as you are all aware. And it will seem somewhat incongruous, therefore, to you if I say to you that we've actually done remarkably well as a country in the last 20 years, something that we tend to forget. And here I can substantiate some more. In 1994, there were 7.9 million people with a job, and last year that number almost doubled to 16 million people in employment. Jobless growth is a myth. It's not the case. The proportion of children who are malnourished fell from 15% 20 years ago to 4% today. The number of BCom graduates has increased from 5,000 to almost 22,000, almost five-fold increase. Black families who live in a formal house was half of black families. It's increased to 3/4 of them, and there are very few emerging markets that can show living conditions data that's that impressive. New car sales doubled from 255,000 units to almost 500,000, and that's the measure of the growing middle class, one of the best that there is. Senior managers in the economy who happen to be black is up from 10 to almost 40%, admittedly heavily skewed towards the civil service, but a different country nonetheless. Families with electricity will almost triple from 5 million to 14 million. And South Africa's murder rate will fall from 67 murders per 100,000 people by 50% to 34. And it stands in glaring contrast to a lot of the perception we have about what's going on. But this is going to get a lot more complicated. Don't be too, your emotions get away from you just yet. Even the stuff we think is terrible, we think there's a lot of positive information around. The race war, if you follow social media or read newspapers, you'll be forgiven for thinking could break out tomorrow. But this is polling that we've done, and I highlight just 3 of them for you. Only 1 in 10 South Africans cares what the race of the teacher of their children is, which is a very good measure of what they actually think deeper down. For all our problems, 9 out of 10 South Africans feel that they can still be proud of being South Africans, although in the next one they clearly identify that the country is not moving in the right direction. And one that might fill us all with a great deal of hope to face the future is this one, that a good 85% of South Africans agree that different races need each other for progress. And when we break that down amongst race and age groups, we can find very little statistical difference, 2 or 3 percentage point difference between the answers that we're getting back from black and from white South Africans. And contrary again to the mainstream narrative that race relations have reached an all-time low point and South Africa has become a country that's divided against itself, we think that there's a very different country, and despite the history, and it's a point of the magnanimity of many South Africans and the current difficulties, most South Africans, a comfortable majority, remain firmly committed to making it work the right way. And you will ask then, well, why do we have this sense of impending terribleness around us? And the story becomes complicated. That's the last 20 years, and that's South Africa's economic growth rate. It averages 3% growth between 1994 and 2003, and for a few 4 brief years, it averages 5% growth into 2007. And when that happened, you'll see later polling showed that popular confidence in the future of the country reached an all-time high point. It's not to last, and in December of 2007, the first of 3 events happened that changed the outlook. It's an electoral conference of the ruling party at Polokwane that ejects Thabo Mbeki, and with him a lot of the pragmatic conservatism that had made possible the economic recovery out of the catastrophe of the 80s. Shortly on the tail of Polokwane is that steep V, which is the global financial crisis. And thereafter, commodity prices are severely depressed in a South African economy where manufacturing's contribution to GDP is halved in the period up to that point. And the combination of the 3 knocks our growth rate down to 0.3% last year and to, well, technically in recession as of earlier this morning. The world's economic growth rate is that dotted line, and we follow each other very closely, but only to 2013, and then happens what we think is the most important single thing you can now know about South Africa, is that as the global growth rate, the dotted one, continued to drift into a fragile, slightly upwards recovery, we peel away sharply downwards, decoupling ourselves from global trends because of domestic policy decisions and domestic uncertainties that are being created. The grey line is fixed investment levels, the year-on-year change. And to get to 5% growth, that is what was happening to fixed investment, which has fallen through the floor because of the extent of uncertainty. The yellow line is consumer spending, and consumers spend the equivalent of 60% of South Africa's GDP, and therefore very important in raising the growth rate to 5%. But the debt levels of households are at this point, here where I'm sort of making some sort of an X, are 60% higher than they were in this era, and the domestic consumers tapped out and cannot kickstart the economy again, meaning it's only going to come from fixed capital investment, and that's not going to happen in the absence of structural reform. That means we don't solve this little blue line, which is the beginning of the political story. It's formal sector job creation, the year-on-year change, and it slows for the whole 20 years, but it's appreciably higher in the relatively high growth era. And the sort of departing argument, once we've dealt with Mr. Bouazizi and how he changed the world, is that South Africa did very well to stage a recovery of sorts, economic, social, political, in the first 15 years after '94. In doing that, it created expectations, rightly so. And at the critical moment when expectations reached their peak, at the peak of Mbeki's power in the latter half of December 2007, the government allows economic performance to fall through the floor, and the gap that has opened between people's expectations of a better life and the ability of the economy to meet those expectations creates the vacuum that's now filled by the populism and uncertainty that makes us, or some of us, a bit nervous. The takeout is this: that's South Africa's growth performance, that's the world's, and the gap is the vacuum that's filled with the populist uncertainty. The likelihood is we're going to spend the next few years becoming poorer, and we'll deal with the consequences of that. This is 1981, all the way to 2019. And what you're looking at is real, so inflation-adjusted per capita GDP. And it's a measure of how wealthy we are as a country on a person-by-person basis. And we start in 81 because that's the richest South Africa had ever been, at 51,000 Rand per head. The mess of the 80s, the turmoil, the uncertainty, Rubicon's right in the middle here, sees us become much poorer and will bottom out at 43,000 Rand a head in 1993. We stage a recovery through the transition years. We get much wealthier much more quickly in the latter half of the 2000s, something that we've forgotten we actually as a country have the ability to do, interrupted by the global financial crisis. But subsequently, as our growth rate tails away, per capita GDP has flattened out. If we drift into a mini long-term recession of negative -0.5 percentage point growth rates, that's all it's going to take for us to become poorer at the same rate that we last did in the 1980s, and the consequences will be the same, and we know that because my analyst team, some of whom are behind you, are able to measure these things. This is not often seen polling information, 2000 to 2015, and the question is, do you feel the country's moving in the right direction? And 70% of people said yes, corresponding perfectly with the 2004 to 2007 high economic growth era when formal sector job creation hit its all-time peak, and subsequently confidence in the future has fallen by 40 percentage points. And we can tell you that there are very few governments or political parties that can survive that collapse in confidence. And we were asked by an agency of the government to find out what this is all about. And we tested all the cliches. They're so dangerous in South Africa, these cliches. Like the race war one and many, and that we failed, service delivery failed, two we've dealt with already. And we tested corruption scandals and encumblers and all sorts of things. And we couldn't make this data move the way we want to see it move. So we started testing other relationships. And this one fits beautifully. It's the real change, so the inflation-adjusted change in the after-tax income of families. And it's deceptively simple. That as families were becoming richer on the orange line, they became happier, and as they got richer more slowly, they became less happy, and vice versa. But when we could show that to the politicians, it was a moment, a Rubicon moment in its own right. Because the advice became, if you want to pull this blue confidence line up, you need to make South Africans prosperous again, and you need to do that on a family basis, which means you need the 5% growth rate to trigger the job creation, which means you need the capital investment, which you can't get because your policy environment is so hostile to investment. Come back to the beginning. The police commissioner, now former Commissioner General Paklane, recently suspended, was kind enough before that to supply us with this. It's from 2004, the number of violent anti-government protest actions, although the General was wise enough not to describe them in those terms, it's more diplomatic, but that's what they are. And the numbers increased from 1,000 to 3,500 incidents over the last decade. As the opinion poll showed South Africans losing confidence, the protests took off, and that real change in the after-tax income of families shows the expected inverse correlation. That as people became more prosperous, we remained relatively stable, but we're volatile on a normal day of the week. As they got poorer, look how the protests take off. As they get richer again, the protests subside, vice versa, tip off into recession now. These protests are going to run sky high, and we spend a lot of time dealing with protest movements, and hence the opening chapters of that young man who died so tragically, but triggered such extraordinary events. As extraordinary as what's coming here, this is the last 20 years, and that's the number of people being arrested annually in the country, up from 800,000 to 1.8 million people. And that corresponds with the takeoff in protest levels. These are mass arrests of young people, while the prison population, that little orange line, remains completely flat. While we're there, we get into law and order broadly. 95 to 2016, and that's the number of policemen in the country, picking up from 100 to 150,000, while that's the increase in the number of private security officers in the country. And we rely heavily on this little anecdote in one of the four scenarios that follows, where South Africa fractures irreparably into little enclaves that break from and go and do their own thing. The murder rate has fallen. The rates are measured off the right-hand axis. It's the number of murders for every 100,000 people in the country. The fall you saw earlier, that's 67 to 34. The armed robbery rate is this one. It's all over the place, but from this point, we've got enough victim data to know that reporting of robberies is so unreliable that whatever you see in the crime data doesn't mean much anymore. All of this, we bring you back to that opening point, is despite the fact that we've done very well as a country. The good story to tell of Jacob Zuma's is true in almost every respect. Unfortunately, no one believes anything the man has to say, and even when he tells the truth, people think he's lying. Consequence of many things. That's South Africa in 1996. The number of families in a formal house is 6 million, in a shack 1.7 million, with clean water 7 million, and with electricity 5 million families. And that's South Africa of today. Doubling in most of those things, and think just of this one, that for every 10 formal houses built in the country, just one new shack is being erected. And the narrative of a country that's overrun by poverty and desperation, of service delivery that failed outright. And yes, RDP houses fall down and sewage flows through the streets and too many traffic lights don't work. All of that's true. The scale of what's been achieved here is quite extraordinary when matched against the doubling of the number of people with jobs, the rollout of welfare, the car sales and all the other things, of which I've just given you a brief glimpse. But that stuff creates expectations, and this is one of the key reasons we haven't met them. This is what's happening in our labour market where people work. It's again the last 21 or so years, and this is the number of people with a job. That's the increase from 8 to 16 million. But in the latter 7, 8, 9, 10 years, 1 million net new jobs have been created, and you can narrow that number down in the private sector, formal sector job creation, outside of agriculture and domestic work, around 30,000 net new jobs a year. And we estimate in the book that for the black unemployment rate to reach the white rate, and to do that in a decade, we need to create 1 million net new jobs a year. Our moving average over the last 20 years is 200,000 to 300,000. We are not even in the game to try and do this. And yet the expectations have been hiked so quickly and the consequences are becoming so significant. The orange ones are people without jobs, which haven't increased much over the last 15 years, and that's a question of definition. If you don't look for work, you're not counted as unemployed. That's a better measure of the labour market. It's the labour market participation rate. And it measures what proportion of people of working age work or look for work. And it's only 60%, but the best one of all, terrible as it is this yellow line, which is the labour market absorption rate. And it measures what proportion of people of working age work in the formal or informal sectors. And it's only 4 out of 10, when normal emerging market numbers should easily be sitting at 7, even approaching 8 out of 10. So we have these very high expectations, born of this very effective service delivery effort, and no means to meet them, and obviously we have to end up in the cocktail that we're in now. Sitting beneath the labour market data is what's going on in our schools, which is a bit of a mess, and there we don't find much of a good story to tell at all. These are matric kids black, coloured, Indian and white kids. And the blue bars are what proportion of them pass matric, and for black kids it's 70%, and for white kids it's 99%, but it's not 70% for black kids. Because half of black kids are dropping out of school before getting to matric. So the black rate is actually only 35 to 40%. The white rate is what it appears, and maths passes of kids, black kids who get to matric and take maths as a subject, only about a quarter are passing with a grade of 30%. And if you stay with maths, that's the number of kids passing maths with a grade of higher than 70% since 2008. And it's fallen from 25,000 to 17,000. 2 in 100 children will pass maths with 70% in matric, in a country that is in many respects at the cutting edge of being a post-industrial, tertiary sector, high-tech, high-skilled type of economy. It makes it even more challenging to meet those unmet expectations. The challenge is deepened by the changing structure of the economy itself. That's the economy in 1991, and a third of value in the economy was generated in agriculture, mining and manufacturing, the primary and secondary industries. Now it's less than a quarter. If you stay with the same idea and you do it in terms of jobs, the red bar is 91, when there are 2.2 million people working in mining and manufacturing. Now down to 1.6 million, when we estimate for our labour market absorption rate, the 40% to be what it should be, 60-70%. This red number should have increased easily somewhere between 5 and 7 million, but it's getting smaller. The politicians are getting hammered, and perhaps I'll jump to my most mainstream analysis of what's happening in the politics we think is actually wrong in the facts of it. This is now the biggest political party in the country. The non-voters. You're over the age of 18, you could vote, but you no longer choose to vote. 40% of eligible voters fell into that category when we last went to vote in 2014. Keep them in the politics because they belong there. They're not apathetic. These are the protesters. And ANC support levels have actually fallen to 36% of all people entitled to vote. Less people voting ANC than people who are choosing not to vote. The DA has risen from 1% to just over 10. It sits at 13%. So the story of the blue wave that will wash the ANC out to sea is for the time being a blue wave that's struggling to get 1 out of 10 people out of bed on election day to go and vote for it. It's not making the inroads that people would think, and there are other parties, the end of the Nats and Inkatha there, and Mr. Malema and his EFF helped to keep that number at 10 today. The great uncertainty, we argue, is what will these guys in the background do? Because if half of non-voters vote again, the ANC loses if they don't vote ANC. The story of ANC defeat has become quite an exciting one, but there's a twist in the political tale, a very intriguing one, and the twist comes out of the local government elections that apparently lent much veracity to the idea that the ANC can lose, but they might have proven to us that it cannot. In 2011, last year we had local government elections, and 5 years previously in 2011 we had them, and the blue elections are 2011. And the ANC got 63%, the DA 24%, the EFF was a twinkle in its mother's eye, we say. Doesn't yet exist, but it was hatching. So let's have an ANC-EFF category together that gets the full 63. Last year the ANC got 53.9. And there are the headlines of it's the end of Africa's greatest liberation party. The next stop is 49, and of course this is going to happen to them. They're led by a dreadful man, why no one said coming. The DA didn't do much. It does 3 percentage points in a context where people are getting poorer, that real GDP number of earlier, where confidence in the country's hit rock bottom, where these large numbers of voters are staying away. It's actually not making the progress that the media is crediting its own great relief with. The EFF gets 8, but the collective gets nothing, not very much less, 62.1 from 62.9. If the ANC goes to 49, we judge with a very high degree of confidence that the EFF goes home. And the ANC, after losing an election, could arguably and ironically be stronger than it was the evening before it lost, and that's a twist in the political tale. We bring this and a great deal more together in the book. And we write it in the way that you should read it on the plane from Cape Town to Joburg. And we ask, where does this go? And that's the point. The knowledge of the future must be as good as the knowledge of the present. Do you wave lots? I'll see you. Where does this go? And very briefly, so I won't leave you completely hanging. Our conclusions are this, that the future of the country hinges on how we answer two questions. Can we in the next decade meet those unmet expectations, or must they by necessity remain unmet? And if so, how do we deal with the fallout? Does the state weaken away as it perhaps runs out of money or respect or whatever the case may be? Or do we end up with a dominant state, perhaps even authoritarian one? And how we answer those two questions take all the turmoil and chaos and uncertainty and give us four choices as a country. The most intriguing we call the rise of the right. We follow the philosophy essentially pioneered by Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore in 1958 that set the groundwork for the Asian tiger economy, is now being pioneered in Africa, in Rwanda by Paul Kagame and Haile Mariam Desalegn in Ethiopia. We've become authoritarian. Civil rights are surrendered. We are no longer the free and open society. Media journalists are critical of jailed. But the state uses that authority to force pragmatic, sensible reforms that position us as a competitive, high-growth, stable and increasingly prosperous society. It is the only model that has made poor countries rich in the past 50 or 60 years. And Africa might very well follow that evolution. I think a lot of South Africans would trade liberty for prosperity and the promise of stability. But in doing so, they take a risk that they end up with authority and not reform. That we call the tyranny of the left. An authoritarian regime emerges again, but without the determination to grow the economy out of trouble, we sink into a decade-deep recession as living standards fall, capital flees, mass migration, and the promise of 94 is lost. The rise of the rainbow is number 3, and this is the coalition. The better parts of the ANC and the DA find each other, and you would be perfectly correct to imagine that there are negotiations on the way between both the EFF and the DA and the ANC at the moment about 2019, and who will be the coalition partner if one is needed. The better parts of the ANC and the DA come together. The reformist agenda is plotted. The adoption of much of the gear thinking of 1996 is back in play, and we march out of trouble. We're volatile because we're a free and open country. We're always volatile. But we become rapidly more prosperous, and we remain a free and open society. And the last one is, and there's not a fifth one, is the breakup. There's no political cohesion. The parties fight themselves to a standstill. The Democratic Alliance, having been gifted the greatest opportunity that opposition politicians in South Africa have ever been offered, has decided to use precisely that moment to launch an internal fight within the party that it doesn't seem to be able to bring under control. Much, I can assure you, to the surprise, astonishment and relief of their adversaries in the African National Congress. Growth is so low that the fiscal deficit, the government runs out of money, can't implement its policies. And as the state weakens away, the functions of the state, as it weakens away, the functions of the state are increasingly fulfilled by ordinary people who begin to take those over as South Africa fractures irreparably, long lines of class and a little bit race, into enclaves that draw a lot of strength from a global phenomenon that sees city-states becoming more powerful than countries and national borders. And the watershed moment for the enclaves that makes them almost independent is cryptocurrencies, which breaks the power of central banks and tax collectors. There is no fifth outcome, and we think there's enough information available in the public domain that from ordinary families to CEOs of largest companies can develop multi-year advance warning of what's going to happen in the future South Africa. And we answer that where it will go in the final pages of the book. And with that context, Jock, I think we can we'll talk about this a bit.
Thank you, Frans. I mean, how insightful. And I know you guys want to know what is Frans recommending. But I'm going to keep you a bit in suspense because I want to dive a bit into some of the things that he's mentioned tonight in his presentation, also some of the things that are in the book. And Frans, one of the staggering things that you mentioned tonight is the job number. You know, you were speaking about where we're missing the mark with the amount of jobs that we have to create, and that's 700,000 a year. Yep. That's massive. So if I'm a small business or if I'm a company in South Africa and I want to contribute to that job, how much would I have to grow without sacrificing my profitability to say I've made a contribution to the increase in jobs in our country? Would that be something that one could consider?
To reduce the black unemployment rate to the white rate, you need to create 1 million jobs a year for a decade. You're essentially doubling the number of people in the country the number of black people in the country with a job. To do that requires, and you must let me finish before becoming depressed, will require economic growth rates of around 8% per annum, which we won't have. But that doesn't matter. All that matters, if you study the history of these things, is not to solve the problem, but to show frustrated people that the problem is being solved. And the polling, the broad common ground between many South Africans, the fact that our polling shows, and we go into some detail in the polling in the book, that most South Africans are possessed of very moderate, middle-of-the-road opinions. There is very little support in the polling for the radical populism of Julius Malema. He polls right down at the bottom of a lot of political leaders. If you show people that life is getting better quickly enough, they will give future governments all the time they need, the 2 decades, to produce a South Africa that's a broadly more equal and fair society, and that's the only breakthrough that needs to happen. The question of sacrificing this to create jobs and so on is a point we've tried to get away from, and a lot of the policy advice and other work, advocacy work we've been doing. I'm not saying that's your idea, but the idea is broadly held that someone in South Africa has to sacrifice something in order for someone else to become prosperous, and we don't think it's the case. The idea that there's a playoff between the corporate South Africa must sacrifice in order for jobs to be created, we don't think is the case. It's probably the greatest strategic mistake of business negotiators in the country to allow that idea to develop. Far more likely is the argument, we can prove it in the data, that a high-growth South Africa with a highly effective education system that's pricing poor people into the labour market is an economy in which there are broadly only winners in South Africa. And I think the lesson for us has been, particularly that little window of 2047, that together we sink and together we grow. But it's very unlikely that one group is going to tear away and have a prosperous and stable existence, while others are having a different experience of a future South Africa.
Thank you for that, Frans. And something else that I thought was fascinating in the book is the effect that family structures have on the country and the context that we live in. We've had a massive amount of breakdown of family structures in this country, mostly instituted through apartheid, where families were broken up, and that has got a huge effect on crime and on our joblessness factor. So my question is, what can small businesses in South Africa do to help bring those family structures? Because the matter of the fact is half of the people in small businesses appoint those people with the broken families. So what effect could it be if small businesses start to play a role in such a significant factor that has created the context of South Africa today?
We're a strange society in that we're a country without family structures. And that's not just an interesting thing, it's an extremely important one, because families are the vehicle that transfer values through generations. And families don't have to be the conservative idea of a man and a woman with 2 children. It's a loving and supportive environment for children to grow up in. We were asked for years why South Africa has such peculiar problems of violence, of antisocial behavior, the gratuitousness of the violence and crime, for example. And we never really could convince ourselves that we had an answer. And then I think it was around 2013, we were asked to look into family structures, and it was for us an awakening because we thought we'd found the answer. We understood a year later that 1 in 3 children in South Africa grows up in a household with both their parents. 1 in 3 grows up with one parent, and 1 in 3 children grows up in a household where they don't see their parents. Only 1 in 3 kids is growing up in a household where they see a parent go to work in the morning and come back in the evening. So majority of children are socialized in an environment where you don't see that behavior. You once a month join your grandmother to collect her pension. We were able to go further and drawing on some international research find that the odds of a young person standing in front of a magistrate before their 18th birthday is very much heightened, perhaps even determined, by whether they grow up in that loving and supportive environment. And you can argue these things, but perhaps the greatest evil of the apartheid system was the final destruction of black family systems. And that point, curiously, has received no policy attention in the past 20 years, but it probably goes, as much as anything, to the root of so many of the country's problems. Rebuilding families is a complicated business, but it can be done, and central to it is to give mothers jobs. If women develop the employment to give them an income that breaks their dependency on abusive and sometimes useless men, the research shows their children do very well as a result of that. And I mean, that's the high-level policy question. The low-level question that you asked me, my colleagues at the back, I think, might agree, is partly because we understand these things. I think is we're a relatively small business, and we give our staff an extraordinary freedom because we understand that they are not the Western norm of a mother and a father and 2 children where the one can pick up the kids from school. And they have absolute freedom to look after their children, bring them to work, go to watch school plays or cricket matches in the middle of the week if they choose to do that. And I would think, and they will agree because I'm sitting here of course, but you ask them afterwards over a drink. I think it lends something to an organisation. It gives a certain something that helps you to retain staff, and I think deliver a degree of morale and commitment to an organisation. It's actually a freebie out there for small businesses to grab if they have the creativity to do it.
Thank you for that, Frans. So I've got lots of more questions, but I'm not going to be selfish with the mic. I'm going to extend the questioning to the floor. I'm going to ask you just to speak up. I will repeat your questions so that everybody has the opportunity to hear it. But I'm not going to give you the mic, so just state your question. So if there is somebody with a question, who would like to ask one? Yes, sir.
Please, yeah. I'd like us to start 3 businesses now for the next 15 years. I want you to prioritize which 3 businesses and prioritize the first one that's our top priority to the third one that'll help mitigate our risk.
For us as a country or for you as an entrepreneur?
No, for us as individuals.
As individuals.
All right, everybody hear the question. So what he is asking is, if we had to start 3 new businesses, what would they be and how would we prioritize them?
Your market is the 5 to 7 million people in the enclaves. They're going to be relatively well off, many high net worth individuals. They have dollarized themselves and immigrated financially, and they're moving in the reverse of the Great Trek, back to a band that will exist between a Gulf Estate and George, through Somerset West, around the Cape Peninsula, around Sea Point and up the West Coast. That's where they're going to be. They're going to be highly skilled global individuals. They will be prosperous and have buying power beyond the reach of whatever catastrophe might befall the South African economy. They'll be committed to living in South Africa because they've given themselves the freedom to insulate themselves to some extent from what may happen around us, not what will happen around us. We had a client who was a bit depressed. They were a global firm that sold knees and hip joints for replacements, medical parts, or something they call it. And they felt very sad about South Africa, and we showed them the enclaves from George to Somerset West, and they said, that's like Florida. We're staying right here. Aging population. Just like Uber, calling what the industry is going to be very difficult. But if you can understand who the client is going to be, and if you're on top of the cutting edge trends of the services that those people are going to procure, you're in a very, very good place to start looking.
And we want this. I want you.
Beyond, underneath that, it's high tech, high skilled services. It's medical, certainly. It's old age homes, it's property. Because as the flow of people accelerates from Gauteng, we can already measure the flow into the Western Cape. Western Cape property prices will eventually be dollarized, and and supply will completely be inadequate to meet demand. Property services, high tech, high skills, telecoms, communications, banking and financial, and if you sit on the cutting edge of South African cryptocurrency at the moment, I think that you're probably in a good type of a position to be in. And of course what we do is useful because South Africa will remain an uncertain place, and there'll be a lot of demand for long-term, there'll be a lot of demand for highly accurate long-term forecasting.
So you are becoming a forecaster. Nontu, you've got a question there at the back.
Firstly, congratulations. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. I've got two questions for you. One the gentleman has already asked. But the one that I wanted to ask is that in all the research and plans, that the statistics research that you've done, what is in place in order to close the gap of the mindsets of our people to be ready for this change that is happening? Because I feel like we are drawing ground, creating a new world that the people are living behind. There's a huge gap to take local families and just the overall society of South Africa to understand the perception that is being passed on their behalf, that they are not being involved. And how is that gap in that research and all those plans? Like how you guys are getting because secondly, if you found this with the answers in the research that you have done. Secondly, these views, from which government is the perspective of these views? Which government did you perceive leading at that point to come up with these potential outcomes? Is it the DA? Is it the ANC? Is it something else? Because at this point, who is the government that we foresee to potentially produce that? Because we don't know, you know. Yeah. So what's the
Okay, thank you, Nontu. So let's go to the first question. So what you're asking there is the difference, the gap between the mindset of the people
Yes.
and what the statistics are telling you, and how do we bridge that gap?
Yeah, is
And
there research, is there any sort of plan that has been found in the research that they're conducting? What structure is there deliberately to change the minds and integrate the minds of our people? Because we come from a broken society. So what strategies in place with all these plans to ensure that we integrate and move towards that which they desire as our people?
okay, so what strategies are in place to bridge that mind gap?
You've just done a book, I believe. So congratulations are also in order for you. Most people are taken by surprise by profound change. And it's not a question of rural people, urban, educated or not. The global financial crisis caught highly educated people by surprise. The events in North Africa were not on the radars of the strategic planners of governments that you would think were on top of this sort of thing. The challenge in a lot of our work is to try and convince people of the nature of change. Modern communications is a tool to do it, but it also accelerates the pace of change. And there's a phenomenon scenario people deal with called change in the nature of change. That the huge shift between 1985 and 1994 can now perhaps be compressed into 3 or 4 years. When I wrote the first book in the series, there's number 1 in 2014, this one now, and we complete the trilogy after the election in 2019. I walked down the beach with Clem Sunter, who was extraordinarily generous throughout this project in his support and advice. And we wrote out the first scenarios, which are different to these, with a stick in the sand. And I asked him, which one will it be? And he said to me the great mistake he made with the Anglo scenario team in the 80s and 90s was to initially put South Africa's transition in the 2000s, because he couldn't believe that it could happen sooner. And he said, one of your scenarios will happen a lot faster than you think it will. And we had one in the first book called The Toll Road that we were looking at 2024 for. And that was the city slipping into coalition government. And the book was 2 years old when the coalitions were and the EFF-DA coalition of all things was established. We have such difficulty with our clients in convincing them of change. Educated people, successful businessmen. Some of them even get quite angry with us that we suggest scenarios that they haven't anticipated. And since the first book, we did a little bit of the most amateur research you can imagine into why this is. And what we found is amazing, that the very function of the neural cortex is prediction. And humans have evolved as far as they have to sit here this evening because of the ability to anticipate what will happen next. You knew there was a lion behind the bush, and that's why you avoided it, and that's why you sit here today, because otherwise you would be wiped out. Simple. And when you deny people certainty of knowing what's happening next, you trigger a reaction, a physiological reaction, as severe as denying nicotine to a smoker. And the challenge is to overcome that. And we meet mass resistance. And to the point that clients that have been with us for a couple of years are starting to buy into profound change. But most we meet early on bet on a variation of the status quo. And I think they will continue to be surprised by the way the world changes around them. Which parties will lead these things? It's very difficult to see reformers before they happen. And that doesn't need to worry us that you can't say it will be that man in that party. Because profound change does happen, often against the grain of history, much faster than we understand. I was telling some of our guests this evening that if the same question essentially, that if we were back in the 80s, you would not have called until quite late F. de Klerk as the reformer. His brother, Wimpy, would have been a more likely bet. Because F is a hardliner, and I think remains one. But it takes for a hardliners to reform. Briefly, I think Rise of the Right might be led out of the relative Marxist left of the ANC, the SACP, COSATU, and possibly the EFF, if they were in coalition by that stage. Why? You shake your head. I'll tell you why. Because they're ruthless, and they're not going to have any money. And they're going to use the ruthlessness to become increasingly authoritarian and do exactly what the Asian Tigers did, because the Asian Tiger leaders were hardline Marxists who became reformers. China's the global epicenter of anarcho-capitalism, and as I also told the same group of guests this evening, wonderfully lectures now the United States on the importance of free trade, under the hammer and sickle. So the Marxist left leads rise of the right. The coalition, rise of the rainbow, is the better parts of the DA and the ANC coming together in one broad collection of people. All scenarios are plausible, that's why they're there. Tyranny of the left will be the alliance shedding its best leaders, even faster than it's done so already, and the DA turning inwards and fighting with itself, and the EFF having a lark and fooling around with its extreme radicalism, which doesn't actually appeal to more than 5% of South Africans. And the breakup, there won't be anyone. You'll be in charge. The breakup is 5% of adults. Yeah, but no, of adults, including those who don't vote. Of ones who do vote, we know it's 8% because 8% voted for the EFF. But across the board, it's around 5%. And it's quite something, considering the history and that half of young black people are unemployed, that the EFF can't push it, and that the DA is spinning its wheels, and that the ANC is in shambles, that the EFF can't break 10%. It may, indeed, it may. It may become the impetus of tyranny of the left. But I think we've got time. We've got time in that polling, more time than people think. The polling is very interesting for us because it contradicts the narrative that we've turned on each other already. Maybe, I don't think we've got 10 years of time. I think we must sort this out into the early 2020s at the latest. But to complete my answer to the lady's question, in the breakup you govern yourself. In your Gulf estate or Steyn City or wherever it is you live. Dainfern, we already live there. Private security, look what the security industry did. The functions of the state, security, healthcare, education. Right, I don't do things like hands, but I think many people in this room have already cut their dependency to some extent on services that you would expect a normal state to provide. Bring in cryptocurrencies and the state has a problem hanging on to its people.
Thank you, Frans. Right, 2 more questions.
I want to ask Frans, what does he think is the most desirable scenario of those for South Africa?
We wanted to leave that question for last. Do you mind if Frans, you answer that question at the end? Andy.
Make sure I answer.
Mine was pretty much the same. It was just a case of Frans Cronje's crystal ball for the next 5 years.
Okay, it seems like you have to answer that question. We've got to. So.
Well, they're 2 different questions because the most desirable and the likely one might not be the same one.
Yeah.
What we think will happen in a high degree of detail is the ANC will make a deal at the end of this year in-house. And the deal will see that there are 2 camps. We didn't get into those this evening, East and West. One camp has Ramaphosa and Mantashe and colleagues, and many others. It's not quite as neat and tidy as business thinks. It's not what it thinks. And the other side is the rural barons of the EFF, the rural barons of the Premier League, and the EFF is we put on the other side, and the Zuma sort of camp. We think a deal is struck to unite the 2 because the Secretary General of the party, Mr. Mantashe, now believes that unity is important above all else, and contrary again, we always so often in that position, to mainstream analysts, we think Zuma is a highly sophisticated opponent who is in far more control of the country. And the commentators who say, look how weak he looks, I get the feeling they hope he looks weak. But I think he's very, very strong and very tough, and he's in and they can't get him out. So they strike a deal. The infighting in the Democratic Alliance is not a personality clash, it's a profoundly important ideological conflict. And it will rage over the next 2 to 3 years. And if it's settled by one side or the other, it will harm the party. So they spin their wheels. The EFF goes nowhere because maybe the lady will tell me I was too optimistic. But I think the common middle ground between South Africans is far stronger than many people think. Because the others go nowhere and the ANC's made this deal, it probably gets a bit of a bounce into the election of 2019. It polled, the last I saw it, outside of the public domain polling, 51%. Put Ramaphosa in the mix and make a deal. Of course, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma polls better nationally than Musi Maimane does. And the ANC is in the high 50s in 2019. The others are nowhere. The trouble, though, for the party is that in striking a deal, it's united, as the radio journalist Reddy Clyde explained it the most sharply, the corrupt with the not corrupt, and the capitalist with the communist, which is impossible. And exposed to any pressure, incoherent, ideologically incoherent political movements break up. And the ANC, if it's lucky, will pull off the pantomime of unity through the 2019 election. When on the myth that when Zuma goes, life gets better, and if Zuma does go, I don't think he's gone, I think he's there, but you can't see him. I don't think he's going to go by then. Because it's united these impossible contradictions, it's paralyzed, and it can't move on the structural reforms. The country needs to become more prosperous. So it wins, it unites people, it's got through an election, but it cannot meet their expectations at all. But it's just hiked those expectations again on the back of the fact that Zuma's formally gone and now everything will be fine. Within 6 months it will face pressures, protests and the like, on a scale that could easily exceed what it's facing today. And under that pressure it will break up and splinter yet again. And South Africans have been through this process of false hope now for the however many time, will become increasingly politically skeptical and begin to hive off into their enclaves. And it becomes the breakup quite cleanly and sharply into the post-2019, 2020, 2021 era. At the same time, weak economic performance means that the split ANC is again at the point where people are talking about it losing a future election. And it's at that point that maybe the hardliners get it together and and surprise everyone and do the turn into rise of the right. We've lost our white-anted away already, but lost completely a lot of the civil rights culture that the country developed in the 1990s, but will become a stable and highly prosperous society in the model of what Lee Kuan Yew imagined in 1958. Of course, they were in Asia 50 years ago, we're in Africa 50 years later. Cultures and histories and technologies are completely different, but the philosophy will be the same. And I won't be, and I think the colleagues that do this stuff won't be totally surprised if into the mid-2020s we are pulling out of the abyss that we're going to flirt with for the next few years. It will be a nerve-wracking time. And by the late 2020s position ourselves as one of the fastest growing, most competitive emerging markets anywhere in the world, the definitive precedent shaping the evolution of high-growth economies across the continent. The ideal case is not one of those two. It's obviously coalition, prosperity, and the volatility that comes with being a free society. For now, for me, it's the breakup and then the rise of the right.
Frans, thank you so much for that. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank Frans for being with us tonight, sharing his knowledge. I mean, him and his team, they've done some tremendous work and doing research about our country and sharing their knowledge tonight. So if we can just give a big hand of applause to Frans and his team. Before we go, there's, with events like these, local is lekker. And it's important that we support our local. So I want to ask two people to just step up front for 2 seconds and just bear with me to hear what they have to offer at this beautiful venue at a certain time. Douglas Kruger and Nontu, would you guys just please come up to the front and just share your insights on what you are having here. So Douglas, these are local authors. They are writing about local stuff. You know, a lot of the times I find that, you know, all of these books that we have are international context. And when you listen to a guy like Frans, you sort of get the sense that, you know, our context is different. Our family structures is different. And these are guys that are writing about the South African context. And I think that is so much more valuable for us and our businesses going forward. So I'm going to give over to Douglas. There you go, Douglas.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I don't want to take up too much of your time because Frans has given us a great deal to think about tonight. But I'd just like to share 2 minutes worth of ideas with you and invite you to an upcoming event. And I'd like to chat with you about the idea of strategic rule breaking. You may have seen in last week's edition of the Wall Street Journal, there was an article titled The $600 Billion Man. And it spoke about ex-President Barack Obama. And this was an unusual one because the Wall Street Journal generally speaks very favorably about Obama. But what they did in this particular case is they tracked the cost of the rules introduced under his administration. And they spoke about compliance rules in America. Now, Obama has introduced more rules and more regulations than any other president in US history. And just by way of one small example, they spoke about the eye-watering cost of $1.9 trillion in compliance costs in 2016 alone. That's how much organizations had to pay before they could start making money. Now, we can very rarely attack governmental rules, be nice if we could. Whenever we try, we end up in a romantic relationship with a brand new cellmate. But we can tinker with the rules within our own organizations, and sometimes we should. I have a new book titled, They're Your Rules, Break Them. And the subtitle is 50 Ways to Smash Silos, Bust Bureaucracy, and Create a High-Performance Culture. In essence, it asks the question, what are people like Elon Musk doing differently? How are these 10x organizations so radically outperforming their predecessors, and which rules can we tinker with? Which norms can we break in order to get the same results? We're hosting an evening on that one on the 28th of this month, and I'd love to see you there. I'll be sharing really the how-to in the book. So it's not terribly theoretical, it's really the practical things you can do in your business in order to innovate and own your industry. We're hoping that that will be the first of a series of events on business innovation, but certainly that's going to be the first one, and we'd love to see you there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Douglas. Everybody's got their diaries here, so 28th of June. Douglas, what time?
7 o'clock.
7 o'clock here at Scoops. 28th, 7 o'clock here at Scoops. Please put that in your diaries now. To support Douglas, he's a wonderful speaker and he's got an immensely insight. And it's not the first time that he's writing a book. He understands how to get a message across. All right, and now we've got beautiful Nontu sharing with us her first book. She is from my homelands. We realized the other day we both from isiZulu, from KwaZulu-Natal. My Zulu is, yeah. I'm going to give it over to Nontu. Thank you, Nontu.
Good evening, everybody. Well, as I've been introduced, my name is Nontobeko CBC, and I would like to take it back home, and so home that I take it back to you. I am a motivational speaker, and I've been in the business of leadership training and skills development and management for 5 years now. And this journey has gotten me to a position where I realize that the more we go around doing coaching and mentorship, people struggle to answer the question, who are you? Why are you here? Your cars are parked outside right now, your clothes are in your wardrobe, your bank account is in your bank, but who are you? When you walk around and there's this shadow of a person that you move around with, you don't know who they are, you're constantly trying to change them, constantly trying to make them fit into a society, but you have no clue who you are. And if the clock stopped ticking right now, and that question you've never asked, it will be so miserable for you. So my book that I'm launching next week is called Isithunzi Sami, which has an ambiguous definition. It means my identity, but also it means my dignity. I ask simple questions like, who are you? Why are you here? Where are you headed? What do you want to live life? Because I think we spend so much time trying to analyze what the next person thinks and not enough having conversations with ourselves. not enough answering the things that really matter to us, the things that really keep you awake at night, the things that really make you want to make it meaningful in this world that we live in. So I'll be excited to see you guys. I've written it in isiZulu because, come on, I can't say my shadow in Afrikaans or English now. I had to write it in isiZulu, but I will interpret it into all other vernacular languages because I think the question becomes even more profound when I ask them in your language. Imagine hearing your mom ask you, who are you? Close your eyes and spend some time removing your career, removing what you've acquired, and really, really dig deep within yourself and answer that question. I'm sure many of you have never taken that moment. So please feel free to come join us next week. It's an opportunity to learn how to read one of our official languages. I want to learn how to read an Afrikaans book. So here's your chance to learn how to read a Zulu book. I love you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noto. And that is next week, the 15th, also at Scrooge at 7:30.
6:30.
Get the detail in the books. It's really a good book to support. Please stay for some drinks at the bar, for some networking, get to know each other. I'm looking forward to the next business book club. It's the first Tuesday of every month. The next guy that we have is a rock background for Def Leppard, Metallica, and he is involved with carrying a message across. And carrying a message, that is what he does well. And carrying a message as leaders and businesses is imperative in moving your business from where it is to where it wants to be. All right, so I'm looking forward to seeing you with